She thought her brother had abandoned her forever, but when he returns, he uncovers a dark secret. For years, Emma believed her brother had walked away and never looked back. But when he suddenly returns, he brings with him more than just apologies. He unearths a truth that changes everything. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, do you believe time can heal all wounds? And if you love heartwarming stories, don't forget to like this video to support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Emma sat at her kitchen table, the morning light spilling through the window, casting soft shadows on the worn wooden floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air, mingling with the scent of the old house she had grown up in. It was a house filled with memories that were both comforting and painful, a strange mix of warmth and coldness that Emma couldn't seem to escape. She had lived in this house for most of her life, but it never quite felt like home. Not after everything that had happened. At 34, Emma had long learned to navigate the silence that defined her family. Silence between her parents had stretched across the years, like a tightrope, keeping them balanced but distant. There were no outbursts, no screaming matches. It was the kind of silence that made her feel like an intruder in her own home. She often wondered if it was her fault, if there was something she had done, or hadn't done, that had caused her parents to drift apart. But as she grew older, Emma understood that the distance between her parents had nothing to do with her. It was something far deeper, far more complicated, that neither of them seemed capable of facing. Her father, once a proud and energetic man, had become a shadow of himself over the years. His expectations were unspoken but always felt, looming like a heavy cloud over Emma's every decision. He expected perfection. He expected silence. Her mother, on the other hand, had always been more subdued, her emotions buried beneath layers of resignation. She would smile and nod, a dutiful wife, but there was something hollow in her eyes that Emma had come to understand as a quiet surrender to a life she never quite chose for herself. Emma was the daughter of two people who had long since stopped speaking to each other, and more tragically, they had stopped speaking to her. There were no heartfelt conversations, no shared laughter. There were just the routines of daily life, the ticking of the clock, the clinking of silverware at the dinner table, the soft rustling of newspapers. Over time, she had come to accept it. There were no grand gestures, no deep talks. There was only silence. And so, she learned to live in it. She filled the emptiness with books, with work, with the mundane things that kept her mind occupied. Teaching was her escape, a refuge where she could pour her energy into her students, trying to give them something she never had, a sense of connection, a sense of belonging. But outside of the classroom, outside of the lessons she taught, she was alone. Emma had spent years trying to distance herself from the past, from the house, and from the people who were supposed to be her family. She moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of Amberbrook, a town nestled in the hills, far away from the ghosts of her childhood. Here, she could rebuild, or so she told herself. Here, she could be someone different. Someone without the weight of expectations, someone free from the silence that had once been all-consuming. But even in her new life, the silence followed her. It wasn't the same kind of silence. She was no longer surrounded by her parents' cold indifference, but it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. There was always a quiet longing, an unspoken desire for connection that Emma had never quite figured out how to fulfill. She wanted family, she wanted love, but she couldn't seem to break free from the walls she had built around herself. She had learned to survive on her own, but at what cost? As the days turned into months, Emma convinced herself that she was content, that she had accepted the life she had created. She filled her time with work, with teaching, with the occasional coffee with a colleague or a neighbor. But at night, when the lights were dimmed and the world outside was silent, Emma would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the ghosts of her past. She wondered about the family she had lost, about the brother who had disappeared without a word, and about the life she had been too afraid to live. And then, one day, everything changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipping through the narrow gap beneath her front door. At first, Emma didn't even notice it. She was busy getting ready for her day, pulling on her coat, gathering her things for work. But when she stepped into the kitchen, the envelope sitting on the floor caught her attention. It was odd. She didn't expect any letters, certainly not one that had been left on the ground. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made her pause. A sense of recognition that she couldn't place. She bent down and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The address was from her hometown, Amberbrook, and the name on the return address sent a jolt through her chest. It was Andrew, her brother. For a moment, Emma stood frozen, staring at the letter. She hadn't heard from Andrew in years. The last time they had spoken, he was a young man full of promise and ambition, someone who had always been the star of their family. But when he left, Emma had never heard from him again. Not a letter, not a phone call, nothing. He had disappeared, just like that. He had chosen to walk away from the family, leaving her behind to carry the weight of their parents' silence alone. Her fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, the words on the page unclear as her mind raced. She wasn't sure what she expected, anger, bitterness, or perhaps just more silence. But what she read was something completely unexpected. Emma, I need to talk. I've made mistakes. Please, let me come home. Her breath caught in her throat, and she read the words again. The message was short, just a few sentences, but it was enough to stir something deep inside her. A flood of emotions she hadn't known were still there. Anger, confusion, hurt, and yes, a small seed of hope began to rise in her chest. Andrew was asking for forgiveness. He was asking to come home. Emma sat down at her kitchen table, the letter resting in her hands, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, the weight of the past, the longing to fix what had been broken. She had no idea how to begin. What was she supposed to say? Was it even possible to forgive him? Could she open her heart again after all the years of silence? The questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was certain. Andrew was coming back, and with that, everything would change. The decision to open the door had been harder than Emma could have imagined. For days after receiving the letter, she had spent hours overthinking what to do, running the scenarios through her mind like a movie reel that never quite made sense. She could feel her emotions pulling her in different directions: anger, fear, confusion, and a deep-rooted sense of hurt that seemed to live just beneath the surface. But the one thing she could not deny was the fact that something in her heart had shifted. There was a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, the estranged bond between her and Andrew could be mended. And then, there he was, standing on her doorstep. Emma's hand trembled as she opened the door, her heart suddenly racing. She had tried to prepare herself for this moment, but no amount of mental preparation could have prepared her for the sight of him standing there. Older, more weathered, and somehow smaller than the brother she remembered. His eyes, once so full of life and ambition, now seemed hollow, distant. They carried the weight of years spent living with the consequences of choices he could never undo. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice rough, as if speaking had become a foreign thing for him. "It's me, Andrew." The words, though simple, hit Emma like a tidal wave. She felt her breath catch in her chest as she processed the reality of what was happening. Andrew was back. After years of silence, after so many questions that had remained unanswered, here he was, asking for something she wasn't sure she was ready to give. She stood there, staring at him for what seemed like an eternity. Time felt distorted in this moment, stretched and broken. She saw the same face, the same features, but now, in his eyes, there was something new. Guilt, regret, and a vulnerability she had never expected from her older brother. It was a side of him she had never seen, and it unnerved her more than she cared to admit. Emma hesitated, her throat tightening. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. She hadn't meant for it to sound so distant, but it was the only way she could manage to keep herself composed. The flood of emotions had come rushing back, memories of when they had been children, before the silence, before his departure. But now, those memories seemed like something out of reach, a distant dream. I know I don't deserve to be here, Andrew began, his voice trembling slightly. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or even at all, but I've spent the past few years thinking about what I did, about how I left you and how I left everything behind, and I can't carry it anymore. I need to make things right. The words were raw and unpolished, but they were the truth. Emma could feel the sincerity in them, and it struck her harder than she was prepared for. For so long, she had carried the hurt alone, never fully acknowledging the hole Andrew's departure had left in her life. She had buried it, convinced herself that she didn't need him. But now, hearing him speak, that hole seemed to widen again, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready to confront it. "What do you want from me?" Emma asked, her voice quieter now, but still guarded. "You left, Andrew. You left me here with everything. You just walked away. No explanation, no goodbye." Her words were sharp, and she regretted them immediately. But they were the truth, and in that moment, they felt like the only thing she could hold on to. Andrew took a step back, as if the weight of her words had physically pushed him away. He looked down at the ground, his hands clenched at his sides, and for a brief moment, Emma wondered if he would turn and leave, just like he had all those years ago. But then, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I know," he whispered. "I know. I wasn't strong enough to face what was going on. I was too afraid to admit the truth. I thought leaving would make everything easier, that I could just escape. But I was wrong, and now I just want to be here. I want to make things right with you, with our family." Emma felt a knot in her chest tighten. She wasn't sure what to say or do. It had been so long since they had spoken, so long since she had allowed herself to feel anything for him other than anger. Part of her wanted to slam the door and tell him to leave, to walk away just as he had. But another part of her, something quieter, deeper, wanted to know if they could somehow find a way to fix what had been broken. "Why now?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Why after all this time? Why now?" Andrew seemed to hesitate, as if searching for the right words. "I've been through a lot. I've made a mess of things. But I can't keep running, Emma. I want to come home. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I'm asking you to try. Just give me a chance." There was a long pause as Emma looked at him, her mind swirling with conflicting thoughts and emotions. She didn't know if she was ready to open her heart to him again, to forgive him for abandoning her, for leaving her alone with all the pain. But she knew one thing for sure. There was something different about him now. Something real. The man standing before her was not the same one who had walked out years ago. This man was broken, but he was also trying to rebuild. She opened the door wider, stepping aside just enough to let him in. "Come in, Andrew," she said softly. "We'll talk." Andrew stepped inside, and as he did, Emma felt the weight of years of silence settle between them. There was still so much to say, so much that had been left unsaid for far too long. But as they both stood in the entryway of the house, something shifted. Just the tiniest crack in the dam of years of hurt. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Maybe this was the start of their healing. The quiet of the house felt different now. Emma could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background, the occasional creak of the floorboards, but there was something else. An unspoken tension in the air, the kind that lingered after an uncomfortable silence had been broken. She and Andrew sat across from each other in the living room, both uncertain of where to begin. The room around them, with its familiar walls and faded furniture, seemed unchanged, yet everything felt new. This place, this house that had once been filled with the noise of family, laughter, and arguments, was now heavy with the weight of everything they hadn't said, the things left unsaid for far too long. Emma shifted in her seat, unwilling to meet Andrew's eyes. She had spent the better part of the last few days trying to prepare herself for this moment, to figure out how she would face him, how she would let him back into her life. But now that he was here, everything felt different. Her mind raced, her thoughts colliding into one another. What had she expected? That things would be easy? That years of silence and hurt could be erased in a single moment? But Andrew wasn't here to erase the past. He wasn't here to make everything okay again. He was simply asking for a chance to fix what he had broken. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Andrew spoke, his voice rough as though the words had been lodged in his throat for years. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his eyes downcast, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "I've spent so much time running from everything I've done. I didn't want to face it. I didn't want to face you. But I can't keep running anymore, Emma. I need to make things right." Emma swallowed hard, her throat tight. She could see the pain in his eyes, and for the first time, she allowed herself to really see him. Not the brother who had left, but the man who had come back, carrying the weight of his own regrets. "You can't just say that, Andrew," Emma said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "You can't just walk away for all those years and expect me to forgive you because you're here now. Do you know what it's been like for me? All these years, wondering why you left, why you never came back. It's been a constant ache, a hole that I've tried to fill with everything else, but it's always been there." Andrew flinched, and the look of pain on his face nearly broke Emma's heart. He reached out slightly, as if wanting to close the distance between them, but he hesitated, unsure of whether it was something she wanted or needed. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I hurt you, and I wish I could go back and fix everything, but I can't. I can't undo the past. I can't make up for the years I've lost, but I can be here now. I can be the person you deserve. I just need you to let me in again." Emma's heart twisted at the sincerity in his words, and she felt a sharp pang of guilt. She had spent so much time blaming him, resenting him, that she hadn't allowed herself to understand the reasons behind his departure. She had only seen his absence as a betrayal, something that cut her deeply. But now, with him sitting across from her, she began to see the cracks in the walls he had built around himself. He wasn't the only one who had been running. "Andrew," Emma began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't expect me to forgive you overnight. You can't just expect everything to be okay just because you came back. You walked away from everything, and now you want to walk back in as though nothing happened. But it's not that simple." Andrew nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. I know it's not that simple, and I don't want to rush anything. I don't expect you to forgive me right now. But I'm here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I'm sorry, to prove that I can be here for you, like I should have been all those years ago." There was something in his voice, something raw and vulnerable, that made Emma pause. She had expected anger or perhaps defensiveness, but what she heard now was simply a man who was grieving his mistakes. And in that moment, Emma realized something. She wasn't the only one who had been living with the silence. Andrew had carried his own burden all these years, and now it was her turn to decide whether or not she was willing to help him carry it. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now," Emma said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But I'll try. I'll try to understand. Because the truth is, I've been holding on to this anger for so long, I don't even know who I'd be without it. But I want to find out. I want to move past this, and I want to see if we can rebuild." Andrew's face softened, and a flicker of hope crossed his eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded, as though processing her words. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was the kind of quiet that came when two people were beginning to understand each other again. When the barriers had started to come down, and they were both willing to meet in the middle. "I don't know what the future holds, Andrew," Emma said quietly, "but I'm willing to try. Maybe we can start small. Maybe we can take it one day at a time. But I'm not going to pretend that things are going to be the way they were before. That's not how this works." Andrew smiled weakly, and for the first time in years, Emma saw a flicker of the brother she had once known. He didn't respond with promises or apologies. He simply nodded, understanding the truth in her words. And in that moment, Emma realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about acknowledging it. about accepting the pain and the regret and moving forward despite it. They weren't going to fix everything overnight. There would be more hard conversations, more uncomfortable silences. But they were here, together, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like there might be hope for the future. Not a perfect future, but a future where they both could find peace, if only they were willing to take the first step. The weeks that followed were not easy, but they were necessary. Emma and Andrew took small, careful steps toward healing, each one fraught with uncertainty and vulnerability. It wasn't as though the pain and years of silence could be erased in an instant, but what they had begun to rebuild was something fragile, something real. The house, once full of a deep, aching emptiness, now had a faint hum of life again, though it was a life that was still being tested, still tentative. They spent long hours talking, or sometimes just sitting together in the quiet, each of them struggling to find the right words, the right way to bridge the gap that had existed between them for so long. Emma tried not to expect too much, but the yearning in her heart, that desire for something familiar, for a connection she hadn't known how to reach for in years, was hard to ignore. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Emma found herself sitting on the porch, staring at the sky as the sun began to set. The soft orange and pink hues in the sky felt like a promise, a hope for something new. She had never been one for grand gestures, but this moment, this quiet moment of peace, felt like a step in the right direction. Andrew came outside and sat beside her, as he had begun to do more often. They had found a rhythm, an unspoken understanding. He didn't try to fill the silence with words anymore. He simply sat with her, and that was enough. "Do you think we can ever go back to the way things were?" Emma asked quietly, breaking the silence. Andrew looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think we can ever go back. We can't undo the past, Emma. We can't pretend like nothing happened. But we can move forward. Together, we can create something new." His words settled in Emma's heart like a balm, soothing the old wounds she hadn't known how to heal. He was right, of course. They couldn't go back. They couldn't pretend that the years of silence and hurt didn't exist, but what they could do was move forward, together. And that was enough. The following weeks were a mixture of small steps forward and the occasional misstep. There were moments when they found themselves retreating into old patterns, moments when Emma felt the old anger rise within her, or when Andrew would withdraw, as though he wasn't sure how to show up fully. But even in those moments, they tried to understand each other, to talk through the discomfort, to push past the walls they had built for years. One of the hardest things Emma realized was learning how to trust again. Trust was something that had been broken between them, something that had withered in the silence. And while Andrew had made his amends, while he was there, trying to show her that he was different, it wasn't easy for Emma to let go of her doubts. She had spent so many years building walls to protect herself, and now she had to let them come down, bit by bit. But every time she allowed herself to be vulnerable, every time she let Andrew in, something inside her shifted. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. One night, after dinner, they found themselves in the living room, talking about everything and nothing. It was the first time in years that they had been able to share stories of their childhood without the bitterness of the past tainting everything. Emma laughed as Andrew told a story about their parents, something that, years ago, would have triggered a wave of resentment. But now she laughed with him. She didn't feel the sharp sting of old hurts. Instead, she felt the warmth of the connection they were slowly rebuilding. "I forgot what it felt like to just be with you like this," Emma admitted, her voice soft. "It's been so long since we could just be together without everything feeling like it was broken." Andrew smiled, the weight of their shared history hanging between them, but in that moment it wasn't so heavy. "Yeah, I've missed this too," he said. "I don't know why I left. I don't know what I was thinking. But I'm glad I'm here now. I'm glad we're doing this." Emma nodded, her heart full. She couldn't fully explain why, but sitting there with Andrew, this new version of him, this version that was trying, genuinely trying, felt like something she had needed for so long. She hadn't realized how much she had missed him until he was back, until she could see him for who he was now, rather than the person who had hurt her. As the weeks turned into months, Emma began to notice the subtle changes in herself. She was no longer waiting for the anger to surface at every turn. She was no longer trapped in the silence of the past. Slowly, she began to trust again. Trust in herself, in her ability to heal, and in the possibility of moving forward. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Emma reached out and placed her hand on Andrew's. He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he gave her a small, hesitant smile. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" Emma asked softly, her heart still unsure but hopeful. Andrew's smile widened, the faintest hint of relief in his eyes. "Yeah, we are. It's going to take time, but we'll get there, together." And for the first time, Emma felt that old ache, the one she had lived with for so long, begin to fade. It wasn't gone entirely. It wasn't as if everything was perfect, but it was a beginning. A real one. They were taking the first steps, both of them, toward healing and rebuilding, toward rediscovering the family they had lost. As they sat there, the night growing colder around them, Emma realized that the journey wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But as long as they kept moving forward, one step at a time, they might just find their way back to each other. Not to the past, but to a future where healing was possible, where family, love, and forgiveness could still bloom. The months that followed felt like a soft unfolding, like the slow, steady blooming of a flower after a long, harsh winter. Emma and Andrew had not yet arrived at a place of complete peace, but they had made strides. Steps so small, yet so significant. Each day felt like a quiet victory, a moment of healing that built on the last. Their interactions were still full of care and caution. They navigated their conversations carefully, unsure of how much to share, unsure of how much of the past needed to be unpacked. But in that delicate balance, they discovered something unexpected. The willingness to be vulnerable with one another was the only way to truly move forward. One evening, after dinner, Andrew sat down beside Emma on the porch, his usual quiet demeanor a testament to the weight he still carried from the years of distance. For the first time in a long while, Emma didn't feel the urge to fill the silence with words. They simply sat together, watching the way the stars began to appear one by one against the velvet sky, the quiet comfort of each other's presence settling into the space between them. "I've been thinking," Andrew began, his voice low, breaking the stillness. "I know I can never make up for everything, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. I'm here for the long haul." Emma turned her head to look at him, his words sinking in slowly, like a balm on a wound she didn't know had been open for so long. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just the quiet promise of someone who was finally showing up. And that was enough. "I'm not asking for everything to be perfect," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I expected when you came back, but I didn't expect this feeling of knowing that I'm not alone anymore." Andrew met her gaze, his eyes filled with quiet understanding. "I'm sorry I couldn't be here for you before, but I'm here now. That's all I can offer." The words hung in the air, weighty and honest. They both knew that healing wasn't going to happen in a moment. It wouldn't come from one conversation or a series of apologies. But this was progress. This was the beginning of something new, something grounded in the understanding that the past, no matter how painful, didn't have to define the future. Over the next few months, Emma and Andrew continued to rebuild. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when old wounds would resurface, when the familiar ache of abandonment would threaten to overwhelm them. But they had learned, slowly but surely, how to move through it together. They learned to give each other the space to feel, and the patience to heal. One Sunday afternoon, Emma invited Andrew to join her at the local park, where they used to go as children. The place felt like a part of their history. A shared space where, for a brief moment in time, they had been inseparable. The park had changed over the years, but the memories had remained. The swings, the old oak tree they used to climb, and the grassy field where they'd run and laugh together. It all felt the same, even as their lives had transformed. They walked in silence at first, side by side, each of them lost in their thoughts. Then, as they reached the old swings, Andrew paused and looked at her. "Do you remember when we used to come here?" he asked, his voice thick with nostalgia. Emma smiled, a genuine warmth in her chest. "I do. It feels like a lifetime ago." He chuckled, and for the first time in a while, Emma could hear the sound of something familiar in his voice, something like the brother she had once known. "I'm sorry I wasn't here, Emma," Andrew said again, his voice carrying the weight of years. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know." Emma placed a hand on his arm, her heart swelling with compassion. "Andrew, I know. I really do. I'm not going to pretend that everything is healed. I'm not going to pretend that the past hasn't hurt me. But I'm learning to forgive you, and I'm learning to forgive myself too." Andrew's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly, as if understanding the truth in her words. They weren't there yet, not by any means. There would still be pain to work through, memories to untangle, but in that moment they had taken another step, another quiet, powerful step toward reconciliation. "I don't think I could have done this without you," Andrew said, his voice full of gratitude. "I never thought I could face all of this. But you made me believe that I could." Emma smiled, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. "We're both learning, Andrew. We're both figuring it out. But the important thing is that we're doing it together. And I don't think I've ever felt less alone in my life." As they stood there, beneath the sprawling branches of the oak tree, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't a grand moment of triumph. It wasn't a perfect resolution to everything they had endured. But it was enough. They had come this far, and in the quiet of the park, in the stillness of the moment, they both realized something. The past didn't define them. What mattered was the choice they were making now. The choice to move forward together. That evening, as they walked back to the house, the air crisp and cool with the first hints of autumn, Emma felt a lightness in her chest. A feeling of hope she hadn't dared to hold on to for so long. She wasn't sure what the future held. They both knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, that the wounds of the past would not be erased. But for the first time, Emma felt like they had the strength to face it. Together. Andrew placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support, of understanding. And in that moment, Emma realized that family, in its truest form, wasn't perfect. It wasn't defined by the absence of pain or hurt, but by the willingness to move through it. To rebuild, to forgive and to love, over and over again, they had found their way back to each other. And that, Emma knew, was the most powerful kind of healing. If you like this story, be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy stories that embraces your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.